Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Cultivating Success Small Farm webinar. Today's webinar is going to be on Idaho irrigation, water rights, and access. I'm Colette DePhelps, and I'm just introducing the webinar today, and then I'll be handing it over to our speaker for today, Karie Boone. Next slide, Karie.
Oh, I'm coming.
Great. So today's presenter is Dr. Karie Boone. She is in Payette County, which is in southwest Idaho, and she's a small farms and food systems educator. And I am Colette DePhelps. I'm the moderator of today's webinar. And I am in North Idaho, located in Moscow, and my area of work is community food systems and small farm. Next slide. Just wanted to go over a couple of webinar tips to help this be an efficient and productive hour for you all. First, if you can close all the other programs that are running on your computer, that could help with your video and your sound, because sometimes webinars can be limited by your internet bandwidth. If you are having any problems with your sound, please go ahead and switch to the telephone. The email that had the link to this webinar also had a call-in number. If you decide to call in on the phone, just make sure that you mute your computer sound so you don't get any feedback. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that you can click on the question box and you can type questions in for the speakers. Or if you're having any challenges with viewing and sound, please go ahead and type them into that box, and myself and my colleague Amanda are standing by to answer any technical questions that you have. There will be times during the webinar that we will pause and you have an opportunity to have your questions answered. So please go ahead and type your questions in as you have them. There will be handouts of today's slides, and they will be posted on the Cultivating Success website. So just know that you don't have to take notes about the slide content itself, that you'll be able to download those later this week. We are also recording this webinar, so you will be able to go back and watch all of it or parts of it. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and again, available through the Cultivating Success website. Next slide. We have a couple of polls to start off our webinar, and this will really help Karie respond to some of your questions and interests and tailor the talk today. If you haven't been on one of our webinars before, a poll is essentially a survey question, and we just go ahead and launch the poll, and you'll see some questions on your screen right now. And you can go ahead and click on the answer that's appropriate to you. I can see how many people have voted, so I can just go ahead and watch until you've had a chance to vote. So our first question just helps us know a little bit about who's on today. Are you a farmer rancher, a student, maybe an extension educator, a researcher, another technical assistance provider, a local food advocate? Perhaps you work for a nonprofit organization, or are a soon-to-be farmer, or we have another category in case none of those work for you. And just so you know, this is a multiple choice answer, so if you fit more than one of these quote boxes, you can go ahead and click on more than one answer. And then we're asking where you're located. If you're in Idaho, which region of Idaho you're in, or if you're outside of Idaho. Right now, 71% of our participants have answered this poll. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds before I close the poll. So now we have 85% of folks have voted. Okay, with that, I am going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. So as you can see, about 31% of people on today's webinar are farmers. We have also several researchers, folks from nonprofits, a few people that are soon to be farmers. So that's really awesome. Welcome to the webinar. And we have people spread out from all across Idaho, with the largest number of people tuning in today from southwest Idaho. So Thanks so much for taking that poll.
Okay, next.
Great. Okay, one more poll that I'm going to launch. And with this, we're wondering if you are already an agricultural water user, or if you plan to be an ag water user soon, or if you're not really sure if you're using ag water. And then if you are using water for agriculture, and this might even be for your backyard garden, are you on a well? Are you using natural spring water? Perhaps tapping into an irrigation canal? You might be on municipal water, have access to a river, stream, or creek near your property, or you might not be sure of where your water source is. We have just over 2/3 of our folks who have voted this morning. A couple more seconds. 70% have voted. Okay, I am going to go ahead and end this poll and share the results. So as you can see, most people on today's webinar are currently using ag water, and most are on wells or are getting water from an irrigation canal, but there are some people that are getting water from natural springs, municipal water sources, rivers, streams, or creeks, or one that's getting some water from another source. So thanks very much. With that, Karie, I'm just going to turn over the webinar to you. And again, those in the audience, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box during the presentation, and we'll pause and answer them later.
Great. Thank you so much, Colette, for doing the introduction, and in general, you and Amanda for setting up the logistics on this. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I've been thinking about agricultural water access for many years, and in particular, I'm getting to know Idaho water rights and access realities on the ground for agricultural lists. And I'm just really excited to interact with you all out there on the webinar. So as Colette said, if you do have questions, please do type them in, and we'll get to a slide here halfway through. We'll stop and take those questions. So for the purpose of this webinar is fourfold. One, we just want to get a basic understanding of water access for small acreage irrigation projects, avoiding water-related legal and social conflicts, which if you have heard the saying, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, we would like to reframe that into something that is more neighborly and more about cooperation around water than it is conflict, which can be very difficult, but I'm hoping this webinar will be a first step in that direction. And so part of that is exploring irrigation organizations as a foundation of water access and their role both historically and contemporarily in agricultural water access processes. And then just considering Idaho as pretty quickly growing, one of the fastest growing states in terms of population, and that we would really like to make sure we're participating in a responsible and sustainable resource-based development of small acreage landscapes. And so to get there, here's a quick overview. I'm going to give you a little bit of historical context related to pioneer irrigators, talk about the different forms of social organization around water use. A few slides will pertain particularly to if you're part of an irrigation company. We'll talk a little bit about irrigating with well water. What is a water right? So that's going to get into kind of the legal side of things. And then continue with different types of water access organizations. And I think this is a good place just to mention that water access and water rights, and whether you're using well or part of an irrigation district, they're really, really context dependent. So For example, up in northern Idaho, you tend to have quite a few more well water users. Down in southeast and southwest tends to be more related to being part of irrigation districts and working off canals and such. And so I'm going to try my best to touch a little bit on each. It is, it does lend itself to being somewhat broad because of it. But we're going to get you all started with some introductory information and then provide you with resources in case you have more questions to follow up with that we couldn't answer. So, and that's basically what I just said. So, I like to think about irrigation water use in terms of being part of a lot of other different water uses in the whole scheme of things. So, agriculture is a major use of water users, but we also have industry, municipal, recreation, wildlife. And so agricultural water use really fits into sort of this amalgamation of a bunch of different types of water use. So we're, sort of in the big picture, we're one piece of the pie of it. And this was really made possible by the pioneer irrigators. It wasn't long ago that irrigation was the primary water use concern. So this goes back to when miners, their families, and the towns that were built needed to eat. So water was the backbone of agriculture. It has become the backbone of agriculture in the arid Southwest when miners were sort of needing food and farms started popping up to feed those populations. And these were, this is particular pictures in Southwest Idaho, and the irrigation infrastructure was really developed by economically poor farmers that labored to make this region farmable. And so I just have a major appreciation for these people. You can see they're not really using a lot of mechanized devices. It's primarily, with their hands, lifting rocks, trying to make farming possible in these regions so that we could eat. And so in addition, you'll notice how many people are there, and irrigation water use is unique amongst those other water uses that I mentioned in that it really was neighbors helping neighbors in terms of, if they wanted to irrigate a particular region of a valley, they had to work together to build that irrigation canal. No one was going to come in. They couldn't afford in the beginning to pay someone to come in and do the labor for them. That changed over time, but it really is about neighbors helping neighbors. And here's just some more pictures how water has shaped the land and the way people organize themselves in the community. They come together. They came together to build these water infrastructures. They really had to organize. Institutions were built such as irrigation districts and canal districts, to build, operate, and maintain the irrigation. You can see the collective labor and the amount of work that went into making water available to agriculture. And so, think about if you are new to growing, or if you aren't quite at the place where you're irrigating yet, you might think about moving out of that history and thinking about who is your irrigation district now? How is your well water accessed on your property? Is there a well? And do you know the name of your irrigation district? Are you part of decision making? Are you voting? Are you paying for shares? Because this is really the foundation of water access for a lot of people. And so if you take a minute, this is more up north region. If you take a minute, look this over, think about what do you see in this picture and maybe some questions you might have. So I always pronounce this wrong, but this is up in Kootenai County. And you can see the blue sections are where there's different irrigation districts, and they then, of course, supply water to that area. And so maybe just take a minute and look at that and see if any questions arise just by looking at this. And so moving on, here, this is down in Canyon County, looking at the Canyon County different irrigation districts, and each color represents a different irrigation district. And on the left side is the legend, and you kind of see how this is organized. And so each farmer or rancher is part of one of these districts or ditch companies. And that's who they go to learn more about how to access water, how much they pay in their annual or their annual shares. And yeah, and so these sorts of maps are available online through Idaho Department of Water Resources, and I'm going to mention them a lot throughout this webinar in terms of a really great resource for finding out more information about how to access water and how to drill a well and such. So I keep mentioning irrigation companies and districts and canal companies because this is the primary way that people in southern Idaho and parts of northern Idaho access their water. And so just to give a brief overview of what they are is that they own water rights and distribute water. They own and maintain the diversion facilities and infrastructure, so the different canals and pumps and whatever it takes to get that water to your ditch. And they are actually quite official in terms of being governed by a set of bylaws created by a board of directors. And there are both public irrigation companies and public irrigation districts and private irrigation companies. And so the private ones are nonprofit base, and then the public ones are the districts. So as I mentioned, you can't really generalize across regions. So it is quite unique how each of these districts or companies work. But it is important in part the important part is to work with your irrigation district and neighbors to understand the irrigation norms and practices in your area. And so you might, if you're new to a piece of land in a new neighborhood, you might want to go knock on your neighbor's door and ask them about how they're getting water and what infrastructure is set up and how the lateral association works. And I'll talk about lateral associations in a minute. Some irrigation companies or canals do not touch the water infrastructure past the delivery point. So that's usually your head gate. So once they open your head gate and water starts flowing, where that water goes and how it gets there is really up to you and the other people on that lateral. So if you do belong to an irrigation district or company, the total acre feet of water granted to each irrigable acre is determined based on the amount of storage water for the season. So even if you have a particular number of shares, it is still dependent on the amount of total water available. And that's usually allocated in terms of acre feet. So 1 acre foot would cover an acre of ground a foot deep. I sometimes think about it in terms of a football field. That's not exactly right, but if you had to visualize it, might be like a football field size with a foot deep of water would be 1 acre foot. Water years it varies, but the average is April to mid-October of each year. So that's when you can access your shares of water. Water does get turned in again in terms of water availability, weather, and it can get turned off based on storage levels. So when you have a short water year or drought year, you may have an early shutoff. And the way you yourself can kind of take control of that and figure out how much water to expect. You can see that that web page there, and so that will link you to various reservoir readings. And this particular one is down in southwest Idaho. And you can see, you want to find out, where is your water coming from, and know how much water is in your reservoir, as this will influence when water will shut off, right? So Cascade Reservoir is a big one for southwest Idaho, and that goes down the Payette. And so if you get your water off the Payette, you might be looking at Cascade Reservoir to see if how full it is. And again, so this is on, you can find this on the Idaho Department of Water Resources website. And I do have this link at the end resources page at the end of this webinar. So again, this is mostly relevant to those with that are part of irrigation districts and canal companies. So the well users, we are coming up on a few slides specific to you. But for this one, if you're quite new to irrigating, you probably want to know that the gate is, your head gate is where your water is allocated, and the gate is open and closed by a ditch rider, and I'll talk more about what a ditch rider does in the next slide. But you can call in an order for water to the company or district. The ditch rider adjusts the head gate. In times of plenty, you may be able to adjust your own head gate. It's a little bit more relaxed, not as tight on water. But when there's less water, you might come out to your head gate and find it locked, because they want to make sure that you're not going to open it, even though when there's not enough water to meet your water rights. And it is the ditch rider who keeps track of how much you are taking and for how many days. They really are important players in the irrigation world. They hold a lot of information in their head. They deal with any neighborly conflicts. They're in touch with the state agency and the irrigation district. They're really important people to really be friends with. You really don't want to make them mad. So let's see. So ditch riders, they spend their days making sure that water is getting to where it needs to be based on your order. They're doing the maintenance. They're the ones that are doing the maintenance for the irrigation districts. So making sure, checking water levels, making sure those who have more priority rights, which I'll talk about in a minute, are getting their water. And this is from a quote from an article on, so getting water to the farmers is a ditch rider's top priority. If we're not doing that, we're not doing our job. So they're there really to help you, and they want to work with you. During irrigation season, they have a really hard, stressful job. They're working 24/7 without a day off, making sure everyone gets their water. And so it's a difficult job, but they do understand the importance of getting farmers and ranchers their water. And so that's what they're there for. And so what about groundwater? So, so just as surface waters, all groundwaters in the state are declared to be the property of the state. The use of groundwater must be acquired only by appropriation, and which occurs through a process with the Idaho Department of Water Resources. And so you need to get a water right approval before you get a drilling permit for an irrigation well. And so those types of applications tend to take 3 to 4 months. And then you also need to you have to look on the Idaho Department of Water Resources website, and they have a list of certified drillers. So they have again, a great resource. I'm quite impressed with Idaho's organization of data and information on their state's website. I think that is rare. And so we're pretty lucky for that reason. And then if you have a domestic well already that maybe isn't necessarily tagged for irrigation, you can irrigate up to a ½ acre of land under 13,000 gallons per day. And so you may not need a specific irrigation well if you're doing like a home garden or a really small acreage of land. And let's see, so on the right here, you'll see the different aquifers in Idaho. It's kind of a not very detailed map. I have a detailed one coming up, but I wanted to get you thinking about, where your groundwater comes from, because here's the map of the different aquifers, and you can kind of take a look and see which color matches with the name and the index box, and then where you're at. And so we are full of aquifers, particularly the Snake River aquifer down at the bottom. And then up top, I know a lot of you up north are using wells out of those aquifers. And I think that it's going to be helpful for you to know which aquifer you're on. And also if there are any management issues with those aquifers. There are a few, again, because I'm trying to cater this presentation to the entire state, I don't list all the issues with each aquifer, but I can tell you that definitely down in the Snake River Plain, and then up north there, I'm trying to remember the name of the one up there, and it'll come to me in a minute, but that you have groundwater management areas where there are specific rules and regulations because of increased groundwater depletion. And so you're going to want to look that up, figure out which aquifer you are, and look up and see what kind of management area that you're in, so you can see what the limitations and opportunities are for you in terms of using that water for irrigation. Although I'm talking about surface water and groundwater separately, I just want to make it clear they are really related. They really interact with each other in a few different ways. So streams, for example, in this picture where the stream is, can gain water from groundwater through the stream bed. So if the groundwater is higher up, like in the recharge area, that's kind of a higher elevation than the stream, that'll flow down into the stream, and vice versa. If you'll lose water to groundwater by an outflow from the river, if the river happens to be higher elevation than the water table there. And so what that means, I think, for you all is, in the summer, your water well level may decrease. So make sure that your intake is at an appropriate depth. And the other thing is, it really is important to recognize that the surface water users and the groundwater users are connected. This is one of the things I really love about water, is it really does connect us all, for better or for worse. It makes it so we do have to collaborate. For those of you in Southeast Idaho, you are probably very familiar with that, what we call conjunctive use conflicts. Because if you're sucking out too much water from the stream, the groundwater people may not be getting their water, and vice versa. And so even if you have a different type of water rights, like well water versus stream water, you're going to want to be in communication with your neighbors and make sure you have a good relationship, and that you're talking about water use before things go south, before there's potential conflicts or drought or whatever. If you want more information on groundwater use and wells, you can see the source of this picture, USGS groundwater in the rural homeowner. I also have a link to that on the resources page, but that's an excellent resource. Okay, so I've been throwing some words around like appropriations and water rights. And so I'm going to go through briefly what is a water right in Idaho, and look, you know, on paper, these water rights legally look well defined, black and white. In practice, I think it's a little bit more messy. And so to better understand the messiness, I wanted to share with you the underlying legal aspects of the water rights in Idaho. And so that is right there, that is a water right. And so depending on your practices and norms for your property's irrigation organization or well use, you're going to interact differently with these water rights. So while this is sort of written on paper, things can operate slightly more complicated in real life when you're dealing with sort of the group, the social norms and stuff around in the area. And so you want to make sure you kind of have your eye on both the legal and the sort of norms-based stuff. And so the water right in terms of irrigation districts is also held in trust by that district. It's for use on the lands for which the water is designated, and is for irrigation only. So your water right will have a specific designation. It needs to be irrigation. The use for it needs to be specific to irrigation, and it's designated to a very specific area that it can be used. So this is interesting. So water right is the right to divert. So water in Idaho is considered a public resource. And so a water right is the right to divert public waters and put them to a beneficial use, depending on what the date is, the priority date of that water right. And that, I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but essentially priority date is when legally you started using that water. And that is important because we are based on a prior appropriation process in Idaho, which means first in time, first in right. So the first people to put that water to an economic beneficial use are the ones that are going to maintain that access. And so if someone has a water right with a year of, say, 1872, and you just moved to the area and your water right is, 2016, in times of scarcity, when there's not enough water, that person with the 1872 water right is going to have priority over your 2016 water right because they were first in time, first in right. So each water right has a few legally defined elements that I've kind of talked about, and so I'll just show you what those are in order. So priority date I mentioned, so that's when ideally you want a priority date that is older than 2016, because that will determine who gets water when there's a shortage. The quantity of water is identified on your water right. Excuse me. The purpose of use, so if you're using this for agriculture, it'd be irrigation. And so you can't use irrigation water for municipal, and you can't use industrial water for irrigation. It has to have a particular tag on it that says for irrigation. You have a particular point of diversion, so where you're going to open your head gate and get that water going. The place of use, they want to know where you're going to use it, how many acres, and the season of use, which usually is summer. And so this is for both well owners and stream users. And so if you don't have a water right, if you are in an area that's served by an irrigation district, you can go in with the irrigation district and get a certain number of shares of their water. But if that isn't an option, you might want to just make sure and check the records on the Idaho Department of Water Resources page and see if there's already a water right somehow associated with the land. And yeah, so you look at their public records. So for example, they have a great set of maps, GIS maps that you can see. This is over near Salmon, Idaho, and these are all the well rights, the well water rights in that area. So a lot. And so you can go on the website and look for the well map, which I also have a link to on the resources page, and see where your right is. And you can actually click on those yellow dots and it'll show you who owns the right, how much it is, and you can open up actually a page on it that shows you a lot of information, like the driller's log, which you're going to want, see when it's drilled, and more information on the water right. Let's see. And so if you do decide to establish a new water right, they have the procedures outlined very specific, step by step in terms of their procedures to submit an application for permit. And so here's a view of their page. You can see, let's see, here's on the forms link. And let's see if I put the new water rights. So you click on that and yeah, and start filling out the process. You probably want to, before you just jump in and do this, you're going to want to talk to your administration office. Each region, west, south, east, and north, has their own office, and the people there are very helpful. I do have, again, a link to their contacts on the resource page at the end of this presentation. So if you're planning to apply for a new water right, or you are applying for a change in use, so if you are in a property that has, say, industrial use and you want to change that to irrigation, you also need to go through a different process, a change of use process. And the administrators at each of these regional offices are extremely helpful in that. So I mentioned water shares. So water shares are not the same thing as water rights. And water rights are, water shares you're able to access through irrigation companies or districts. So, company or districts hold water rights, and then members then own shares in that company. And the typical standard, although this varies greatly, is 1 share is 1 acre foot of water. And so these shares are like paying for a portion of the pool of water rights owned by the irrigation district. And it also does this thing where it kind of levels out that seniority system where since the company has this sort of pool of different water rights, what ends up happening is, especially in Southwest Idaho, you might just end up getting an on and off dates based on the available water, instead of having to think about, does your neighbor have a more senior right or an older water right? And so they're going to be able to water when you can't. It's kind of levels the playing field in a little bit. And through this process, as shareholders in the irrigation entity, you pay assessments for maintenance of water systems, infrastructures, and other administrative expenses, and that's usually twice a year. And so you want to make sure that you figure out what the cost is for that. It's usually not relatively, as considering how important water is to making your farm work, the amount of that you pay twice a year tends to be not terribly high. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and stop talking for a minute and see if there are any questions up until now.
Karie, we do have one question. Okay. Amanda asks, I'm not able to ask, well, she's not able to ask her question in the regular question and answer, so others might not see it. But her question is, if you are a family farm that's been using water since the early 1900s, but the farm never applied to have a water right, where in the priority or seniority will you be if you apply for a water right in 2019? So you have a historical...
Amanda, yeah, so that, I believe, I would say that depends on the district that you're in, because in some districts or regions of the state, they should have a statewide one way of doing it, but in practice, because there's so many now different water use management areas and different water issues, it tends to be more convoluted. However, I believe the main point is to, if you can verify or somehow prove that your family has been using that water since the 1900s on that specific quantity of acres, then you should be able to, as long as you can verify it, you should be able to get that right backdated to whenever you started using it. Again, depends on the region. Like Southeast Idaho has a very specific way of it's called adjudicating water rights. So adjudicating meaning that you're getting an actual water right, a legal water right. You're appropriating this particular amount of water. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but if you have I don't know the exact list of things that Idaho wants to see in terms of proof that you've been using that water since the early 1900s, but you should be able to find that by contacting your regional administrator.
Thank you, Karie. I do know that one person up here in Moscow who is trying to investigate his water right, he has a picture of the well on his property that is in use from 1924. So that's one way that he's substantiating that the water had been accessed very early on in terms of that priority right. So old pictures are a good option.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question that just came in, and it's from Sheila. She says, we recently purchased 50 acres of land with irrigation water rights. We also found a well on the property. There is no record of the well with the state and no markers on the well. The previous owner knows nothing about the well. It is not affordable to pay a well company to investigate the well. How can we find out if the well is functional?
That is a great question. I would say to, in lieu of giving you like a long process, I would say to contact your Rural Water Users Association or the Idaho Department of Water Resources and see if they have a particular process for that.
Thanks, Karie. Sheila has a second question as well. She says there's a seasonal stream that runs through their property. Can they use the water from the creek to irrigate?
Not unless you have a right to it, because that stream probably runs into a larger stream and into a river, and that river probably has a lot of water rights on it already. And so that stream is technically, someone else might already have the water rights to that. And it's essentially illegal to appropriate any water without having a right to it.
Thank you. We have another question that has come in. It says, I applied for my water right in North Idaho, January of 2018. Due to internal issues and confusing split, my right wasn't issued until February 2019. My neighbors applied and were issued in May 2018. They both date back to 1890. In times of drought, will my neighbor get use before me due to his processing date?
You know, you should have one date that is your seniority date. So my understanding would be that if you have a earlier or later date on yours, whoever has the later date is going to, it should not depend on the processing date. Again, it does, it's really hard to make generalizations in this area because of the distinctions between regions. But I would say whoever has the oldest water right, according to first in time, first in right, would have would have the seniority in that case.
So what I understand you to be saying, Karie, is that they'll need to look at the actual date that the water right was given.
Correct.
And she says it was split, so they have the same date. So it seems like they probably have to go back to whoever provided their letters and ask that question about seniority, if they have the same date, because it was a split right.
Ooh, yeah. Okay. So, yeah, there's, yeah. So if they had the same date, that's a good question. I don't know who would come out on top with that one. So yeah, sorry. I would then direct you to the Department of Water Resources then on that specific detail.
Okay, we have another date question that has just come in. Is the date on the original document or date considered to be the priority date, or does that date change every time the property ownership changes?
Lots of depends there. Sorry, I don't have a straight black and white question or black and white response for you. If the water right was deeded to you with the property, you should maintain the date that is on the original water right. And beyond that, I would say you would need to contact, again, Department of Water Resources to double check. But yeah, if you were deeded the water right with the property, you maintain that same seniority date.
Great. Thank you. That is the last question for this Q&A session.
Okay, thank you. Really good questions, you guys. And again, it's so different even within the state. So so it's really hard to give generalizations on that sort of thing. Okay. So, excuse me, for both, let's see. So I just want to give the big picture of the different types of water organizations because they are so crucial to water access. So, excuse me, the lateral ditch, so we've talked about irrigation companies and irrigation districts, right? So those are kind of down at the bottom of the circle. The lateral ditches, I've mentioned, but they're really the smaller neighborhood organizations. Those organizations are essentially, once the ditch rider opens your head gate, the water flows into your lateral ditch. And so that's where it's out of the hands after that point, it's out of the hands of the ditch rider and the irrigation district. It's in the hands of the lateral ditch association. So that's you and your neighbors working together to maintain the laterals, do the cleanup, the weeds, make sure the laterals are well maintained. And ideally, you're doing that as a community. That doesn't always happen. And in some cases, ditches, the lateral ditch association, sometimes also called community ditches, may decide to pay somebody to do the maintenance, but that's up to you guys as within your lateral ditch association. Another term for laterals is delivery ditches. The drainage districts are becoming a little bit more rare, but they do still exist, and they were developed to deal with the drainage issues. A lot of water was pooling up at the end of crop rows, and they're having a lot of issues with flooding for the water that was not infiltrating into the ground. And so sometimes those are managed by irrigation districts, and sometimes they're not. And so that would be another group, organized group, that you may be voting in, paying dues to, and being, just generally being a part of. And so we talked about irrigation districts as being the public entity and the irrigation companies. Both of those employ the ditch riders who make sure you get your water. And then the Idaho Department of Water Resources that I've mentioned a bunch already, that's where you go to for both water rights, both ground and surface water rights. And they just, again, have a really great website full of information. And because we have a number of you here that are getting their water from irrigation districts and companies, I just want to mention that, so the lateral associations, that is a neighborly association that deals with erosions and weeds, and again, sometimes the group decides to pay someone else to manage their lateral ditch. Just that they exist and they're extremely important to be a part of. I think I've sort of mentioned this a few times already, but just that they are this opportunity to create a community in your area. You can collaboratively develop the bylaws and the rules of cooperation to keep that system functioning and avoid conflicts. And as we look at climate change and desertification, we do want to make sure that we're getting along really well with our neighbors. And that's really been one of the big issues as I've talked to different irrigation districts and companies and just new and beginning farmers in general, is the already the sort of lack of community and communication that goes on between water users, and that can tend to lead to less than ideal community relations, when it really could be a catalyst for creating more a community around agriculture in your area. And then the drainage districts. So again, their primary function to remove the excess irrigation water. And you can see how they're doing it there with the pipes flowing out at the end into the drain. They're also legally established public entities, and they do a lot of the maintenance on the drainage ditches. So getting down to the last few slides here, and focusing really on your water and your property. And so if you haven't bought property yet, make sure you do your homework. Where does your water come from? Look up your well driller's log on the Department of Water Resources database. You can access that through that map I showed you with all the little yellow dots. You can click on the dot and it will show who owns the right, and give you the history of that well and the level of the well water, groundwater there. Figure out who your irrigation district or company is, and were you deeded shares or water rights with the land that you maybe recently purchased. And so, let's see, okay. Know about who your district or irrigation company manages water payments and water delivery. How do they do that? If you're on a small acreage that was sort of cut up from a larger property, you might have kind of wonky water rights. And it's called interrupted. So there was maybe one main water right for the entire area, and then the rancher or farmer cut up that into 5-acre plots. You may need to have to install a new head gate, dig a new well, or figure out what the previous owner did to get water to the different areas. And so it may not be straightforward, and that's again where it really helps to have good relationships with your neighbors. Reminder that not every year is going to be the same dependable water access. That there'll be some good years where the ditch rider leaves your head gate unlocked and you turn it on and off as needed because it's a good water year. And then in bad years, it might be locked and they're going to follow a 24-hour notice rule on the call for water, and it can be shut off. Your water may be shut off early because the reservoir was not completely full. And so, think about that as you're planning your what you're growing. Keep an eye on those reservoir levels and know that, if they're pretty low, you might want to plant something that maybe doesn't need a lot of water after July, or find another source of water. If your land came without water, I think the first step is to find out why there is no water with the land. there may be a reason that there's no water. Contamination issues, maybe it's not a great piece of land to irrigate or to grow food on. But you can apply to dig an irrigation well with the Department of Water Resources, or you can do the half acre allowed by a domestic well if you're stuck in that situation. And so, excuse me, I showed in the beginning how the different irrigation districts were set up, building the canals and setting up the laterals as neighbors helping neighbors. And this has kind of changed as we see a lot of land moving hands, new people moving into areas where before, you might have had large acreages that have been cut up into smaller acreages now. And that communication and sort of understanding of the norms of how the water access works between neighbors and also between people and the irrigation companies and districts. That's what has been identified as one of the biggest challenges, to make sure people are talking to each other. If they have questions, going to your neighbor's house, knocking on the door, offering coffee, and figuring out where they are getting their water, and so figuring out how your lateral association cooperates. So that's a really important part about water access that I think gets overlooked often. And so that's really the end for me. Here's a list of resources which will be in the PDF that will be posted. I'm also posting on the website, there'll be a document that goes through the process of how to apply for a new water right, which is also kind of nice just to learn more about water rights and what they mean. So Colette, let's see, do we have any more questions?
We haven't had any more questions that have come in yet. So maybe I'll go through our last few slides, and if some questions come in before the very end of the webinar, then we'll take a pause and answer those questions. So if you could go to the next slide, Karie.
Sure.
So I wanted to remind everyone that at the Cultivating Success website is where you're going to be able to find links to our upcoming programs, including this webinar series. Next slide. When you click on the 2019 webinar series page, you'll see the list of upcoming webinars. Our next webinar, which is on February 25th, is going to be on adding value to your wool for the fiber artist market. But for each webinar, we are recording it. The recordings will be accessible from this web page. And you'll also be able to access a downloadable document with a copy of today's slides, and you'll be able to access the other handout that Karie mentioned. Next slide. Cultivating Success, our program is a partnership of the University of Idaho, Washington State University, and Rural Roots. We're almost into our 20th year, and we're really excited to be able to bring you this webinar series and other programming. I do want to remind you that in addition to this 2019 webinar series, we did offer this webinar series last year. If you scroll to the bottom of the list of 2019 webinars, there will be a link that will take you to a page where you can access all the recordings from 2018. Next slide. We really value your feedback on all of our webinars. As soon as this webinar ends, you'll have a link to a post-webinar evaluation that is automatically going to appear in your browser. We would really appreciate your taking a couple minutes to complete that evaluation for us. The average time for completing one of our evaluations is 4 minutes, so it really is short. But your feedback about the content of this webinar and what you would like to see on future webinars will help us continue to develop this program. So with that, I want to thank you for attending today's webinar. We had no further questions, Karie. Thank you for covering a very complex topic and breaking it down into understandable pieces. That was a great introduction to water rights and water access in Idaho.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Feel free, my email is there. Feel free to contact me with any follow-up questions. Yeah, and thank you for participating.
Great. Have a great day, everyone.